Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're taking a completely objective, analytical look at one of the most fascinating topics in history, the evolution of Islamic political succession. Over the next few minutes, we're going to trace exactly how the concepts of the caliphate, emirate, and sultanate evolved over 1,000 years. It's a pretty incredible story, really. It's all about how these grand, overarching ideals collided with the gritty, everyday realities of human history.
Everything starts right here, with this massive, inciting historical question. After the passing of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the Muslim community was suddenly staring down an unprecedented political crisis. Who will hold leadership and, well, exactly how should they be chosen? You see, the Quran provided these profound ethical ideals, things like justice, consultation, and trust, but it brilliantly refrained from dictating a rigid step-by-step method for political succession. And that left the early community and centuries of subsequent empires to figure the whole thing out for themselves.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll establish the principles of leadership, then look at the Rashidun era, examine the shift to hereditary rule, and explore lineage and military power. Finally, we'll hit the Ottoman era before evaluating principles versus practice.
Section 1. Principles of Islamic Leadership.
So because those foundational texts didn't come with a strict structural blueprint, a set of core principles became the benchmark, kind of like our historical scorecard for legitimacy. We're talking about justice, shura, which means consultation, trust, piety, and public acceptance. But, and here's the catch, without a fixed mechanism to enforce these ideals, human choices, messy political realities, and sheer power dynamics heavily shaped how succession was actually practiced on the ground.
Section 2. The Rashidun Caliphate Era. This era was the immediate period following the Prophet's passing, and historically, it's widely regarded as the most idealistic period. This is where those core principles we just talked about were most strictly attempted. To give you a sense of scale, our journey begins in 11 AH with those early caliphs, but we're going to sweep through massive dynastic shifts today, from the Umayyads to the Abbasids, all the way down to the Ottoman consolidation centuries later. It is a vast sweep of time.
The absolutely crucial point here is that even during this highly respected era, there was no single, fixed method for choosing a leader. The diversity is actually incredible. Abu Bakr, chosen after broad consultation. Umar was nominated by Abu Bakr, but only with prior consultation and collective acceptance. Uthman was elected through a highly organized 6-member electoral committee, and Ali received public allegiance after a period of intense crisis. 4 leaders, 4 entirely different methods. But the unifying thread? Consultation, competence, and public consent were always at the heart of the process.
Section 3. The Shift to Hereditary Rule.
This is the major plot twist in Islamic political history. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast it creates. During the era of Muawiyah, a fundamental shift occurred when Yazid was appointed as the crown prince. Literally overnight, this transformed the caliphate into a dynastic empire. Those idealistic criteria of piety, trust, and free consultation, they were suddenly overshadowed by a new reality: family ties, political survival, tribal influence, and military backing. Now, neutrally speaking, while free elections were severely limited, this new hereditary system did allow the Umayyads to highly stabilize state order and expand their borders immensely.
And this trend definitely didn't stop when power changed hands. In 750 AD, the Abbasid dynasty overthrew the Umayyads, and they did it with bold claims of restoring true religious legitimacy. But once they were actually in power, the hereditary crown prince system was just further solidified. The influence of the royal family in internal court politics became the absolute dominant forces of succession. People still talked about the concept of shura, sure, but in practice, its actual political weight became largely theoretical.
Section 4. Lineage and Military Power.
As the centuries rolled on, that concept of centralized power began to fragment across the Islamic world in some highly unique ways. Consider this fascinating dynamic from the Seljuk era. We actually see a literal formal split in leadership. You had the caliph sitting in Baghdad, who had evolved into mostly a religious and symbolic figurehead. And on the flip side, you had the sultan, the practical, boots-on-the-ground ruler who held all the actual military might and political power. It's a remarkable separation of religious authority and executive state power born out of pure political necessity.
And depending on where you looked, legitimacy was being claimed in totally opposite ways. The Fatimid rulers, for example, based their entire right to rule on their claimed lineage, tracing their bloodline directly back to the Prophet's family. But contrast that with the Mamluks. The Mamluk leaders were actually former slave soldiers. For them, noble lineage meant absolutely nothing.
They rose to the highest ranks of power based strictly on extraordinary military merit and capability. Talk about a completely unorthodox experiment in Islamic history.
Section 5. The Ottoman Empire Era.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because this is our final historical stop. The Ottomans eventually pulled all these fragmented concepts of power back together. Now, in their early days, it was a brutal survival of the fittest. Princes from the royal family would literally compete for power, and the victor became sultan. Over time, thankfully, these succession rules were strictly formalized to prevent total chaos. And then, the ultimate consolidation occurred in 1517 AD, when the Ottoman Sultan formally claimed the title of Caliph as well. The practical military ruler and the symbolic religious leader were finally merged back into a single, incredibly powerful figure.
Section 6. Evaluating Principles versus Practice.
Okay, it is time to bring back our initial historical scorecard and see exactly what survived this thousand-year journey. When we conduct a grand historical audit of this timeline, a pretty stark divide emerges. On one hand, despite the shift to monarchies, these later empires successfully maintained a baseline of justice, robust state order, unity, and the protection of their subjects. They fostered incredible centuries of civilization. But on the other hand, what was forgotten? Well, early ideals like broad consultation, public participation in choosing a leader, and the non-hereditary transfer of power gradually faded away, mostly replaced by the pragmatic needs of dynastic survival.
Which leaves us with this powerful concluding thought based on the historical record. The overarching lesson here is that Islam provided flexible core principles, justice, trust, and consultation, rather than a rigid, unchangeable political structure. How these are implemented changes with the centuries. So I'll leave you with this question to ponder. If the structures of power are always shifting, how does our modern era face the ultimate test of protecting and applying these demanding foundational ideals today? Thanks for exploring this explainer with us, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world.